Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to day 2 of baking, and we're going to be going into chapter 32. I did guys, I wanted to backtrack a little bit and look at your baker's percentage. I want you to keep in mind baker's percentage, and this is going to be important, especially when we start going into the kitchen and you're having to convert recipes from these ginormous amounts, because you know in the industry you make everything big. All right, you're not making one cake recipe, you're making it times 10 or times 8 or times 9. So the way that you're going to convert your recipes, and there's really 2 ways, and that's what I want to point out. You can use your baker's percentage formula, which is the weight of your ingredient over the weight of your flour. And then when you divide the ingredient by the flour, which is always 100%, if you look at a recipe in your book, flour is always 100% of that recipe, okay? Everything else is scaled out based on that flour. And we will go deeper into that when y'all are in class. But I want you to remember weight of the ingredient divided by the weight of that flour. So if you look, literally, let's look on page 922 together. If you look at that little example, 30.2 at the bottom of that page, all right, there's 2 things I want you to know. Look at the flour, and you see the percentage of that flour. It's 100%, right? All right. Now, the one thing I want to point out on top of that is you have all these ingredients. See the original quantities there? You have to convert those quantities to the same increments. So they all need to be in ounces. They need to be in equal increments or equal either ounces, grams, whatever. All right, you can't take a pound and convert it up against an ounce. You got to take that pound and turn it into ounces. All right, or if you have a recipe with grams, you got to convert everything to grams. Does that make sense? All right, you have to have everything into the same weight measurement, if you will. All right, and then your flour is always 100% of that formula. That's what you're basing everything on. You need to remember that, all right? When you come back and you have your baker's percentage homework, flour is 100% always, all right? And then you have to convert all your ingredients into the same measurement type, if you will. And then on top of that, all right, you're gonna have the weight of that ingredient. So if you look at that, let's look at the sugar, all right? So the sugar is 6 ounces, right? And the flour is 16 ounces. You're going to take 6 ounces and divide it by the 16. Somebody do that with a calculator real quick. Somebody pull out your phone and do a calculator. Take 6 divided by 16. What's that answer?
0.375.
It's what now?
0.375. So the percentage would be 37.5.
37.5. That is correct. All right. So that is your baker's percentage. Well, you got to times that by 100. So basically, you're going to have the 0.375. If you multiply that by 100, it's going to give you the 37 point. That is correct. The 37.5. So keep that in mind. That is your conversion amount. Okay. That is your conversion factor. So you would take that and multiply the rest of your ingredients by that. All right? Does that make sense? And we'll go over that again and again and again and again. Now, let's say your recipe makes 20 cookies. Well, let's use this one. Okay. your recipe yields 20 cookies, all right? But you want 48. So a quick version of that, without going through all the baker's conversion, is to take the new over the old, okay? So if you take the new, which is 48, and you divide it by the old, the recipe makes 20, right? But you want 48. So if you take the new divided by the old, what is that? Somebody do that for me.
2.4.
All right. So you would take the rest of your ingredients and multiply them by that figure, the 3.4, correct? And then that way you're scaling up. You know, it's going to be greater than 1 if you're scaling up, right? So you would take the rest of those ingredients and you're going to multiply them by 3.4, and that's going to increase each of your ingredients in your ingredient list so that it yields you the 48 cookies. Do y'all follow that?
Is it 2.4 or 3.4?
What did I hear? Let me do it.
2.4.
2.4. Okay, Kara, thank
Yes.
you. I thought I heard 3.4. I was relying on what y'all said. So 48 divided by 20. Yep, 2.4. So you're going to take each ingredient line and you're going to multiply that by 2.4. So that's going to increase all of your ingredients. Y'all getting it? So that you have the proper quantities of each ingredient to yield you the 48 cookies. And let's do it the other way. Let's say a recipe calls for 1,000 grams of sugar. All right, let's just say 1,000 grams. I'm used to grams, so let's say 1,000 grams of sugar. But you only have 800. All right, so that's going to be a little bit different, right? So we're going to use, can y'all see this? We're going to use this same formula right here, new over old, right? So the new, we only have 800 grams of sugar, right? That's all we have. But the recipe called for 1,000, correct? Right? Y'all with me? All right, recipe called for 1,000. So what's 800 divided by 1,000? Might help if I do 800 divided by 1,000.
0.8.
0.8, which is going to be, you times that, well, no, you don't times that, it's just 0.8. So you notice, here's my point. That's 0.8, all right? You notice that's less than 1, right? So less than 1 means you're decreasing the quantity in the recipe, right? So now you would take that recipe and you would times everything by that 0.8. And that's going to decrease all of your ingredients to yield you the proper formula based on that 800 grams of sugar. Are y'all following that? So you're going to know if it's 1 or above, you're increasing your ingredients to match a larger number, right? A larger quantity. It's going to be below a 1 if you're decreasing that recipe to match a lower number. So do you see the importance? If you don't remember nothing else, this right here you got to know because the book tells you to know. But I'm going to tell you, this formula right here, even in savory, in pastry, in everything, you need to know new divided by old. That's going to give you an equation to adjust your recipe, bottom line, all right? And I wanted to backtrack with that. That is very important to know, all right? Now, let's dive into our chapter for today. Does anybody have any question on this so far? And we'll go deeper into this, and we'll do some worksheets when y'all come back to class, okay, to help you better understand this. But the two things I need you to know, flour is 100%, New over old changes your formulas or anything really. That is a base formula to know. And then your baker's percentage is the weight. First thing you got to do is get your ingredients into a common measurement. If it's teaspoons, you got to convert everything into teaspoons. If it's grams, you got to convert everything into grams. If it's cups, you got to put everything into cup. Whatever your increment is, generally, you're going to convert it into ounces for most recipes or grams. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then definitely remember to multiply that by 100, and you're going to get a conversion factor. Okay, and then you're going to do all of your ingredients by that conversion factor. All right, any questions on that? Nope, got it. How many people know how many grams is in an ounce? 28.35? Remember that. So it's easy to convert a recipe that's in ounces into grams. Now, keep in mind, fluid ounces and ounces are different, and there's a slight variation, but a good rule of thumb is 1 ounce is equal to 28.35 grams. Okay? All right, now, chapter 32, we're going to be starting on page 944. We're talking about yeast spreads now, okay? When y'all come back, we'll be making some yeast spreads. We'll be working with some poolish and some yeast. The thing that you need to know is yeast is a living organism. Did y'all know that? It actually is a living organism. The one thing I want to point out, and of course, PowerPoints are probably going to catch up with that in just a little bit, but there are basically 3 types of yeast. You've got your fresh yeast, which is compact yeast. You've got your active dry yeast, and then you have your instant yeast. Compressed or fresh yeast is just that. It's fresh. It's not been dehydrated to be preserved. It is straight up fresh yeast, and it has a short shelf life. Believe it or not, fresh yeast is a little difficult to get in our area because of the heat, and to even transport it from a northern or a cooler temperature to us becomes complicated. Unless it's changed, I, in the past, have tried to get fresh yeast here in the Southeast, and I was unsuccessful. I know we are able to get it from suppliers for the restaurant and stuff like that, but for general use for the public, I'm not so sure you can get it. Now, active dry yeast is completely dehydrated, all right? So what that means is all the moisture has been removed. It's basically been put to sleep. I love to refer to it as been put to sleep. You have to literally wake it up with some warm, fuzzy water and feed it. So typically we bloom it, or I like to call it waking it up, in warm water, milk, some sort of liquid. And I'm sure, how many of y'all have worked with yeast? I know, Josh, you said you've been making some bread. Did you use active dry or instant?
I was using instant. It was already in little packages that I had found at my local grocery store.
The rapid rise, the instant. Instant is only partially dehydrated, so it has a shelf life, but it doesn't require the warmer temperature. Now, the one thing I need y'all to remember is when we activate yeast, or when we wake yeast up, usually it's the active dry yeast, your temperature needs to be 105 to 110 degrees, all right? So anytime I say you need to wake up your yeast or bloom your yeast, the temperature is gonna be 105 and 110. Now, if you're using instant yeast, or if you want your yeast to wake up slower, you will see some recipes that call for a room temperature liquid or a 90-degree liquid or something like that. Again, you need to pay attention to your recipes, because sometimes they will use the friction factor, which is the act of your mixer heating up as you're using it when you're working a product. the friction factor, you will have a heating of that product. So sometimes recipes or formulas will use that as additional heating. So make sure you pay attention to your recipe, the type of yeast that's going to be used in that recipe, and then the technique or what you need to do. All right. So yeast, like I mentioned yesterday, with it being a living organism, it needs to eat. As it eats on carbohydrates and sugars, as it's yum, 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 it literally, you guys don't laugh, but it is expelling gas. And it is that gas that gets trapped. Remember in the baking process, right? Gases are formed, gases are trapped. Well, they're trapped in all the strands, your protein strands that glucanize and gelatinize and all that kind of stuff in your flour. And that creates, y'all ever look at your crumb or your texture of your product and you see all those little holes? That is trapped gases or air in your product, and that's what gives rise to your baked good. So they actually eat on the carbs or the sugars, and then they expel carbon dioxide and ethanol, okay? This is what's called fermentation, and you need to know that. Fermentation, we bulk ferment. All right, don't get confused, especially when we start talking about yeast and breads in particular. The first rise is called bulk fermentation or fermentation. That's where the majority of the rise takes place. We put it in a warm, fuzzy spot. All them yeast are nice and comfy, and they're warm, and they're moving and activating. They're eating, yum, 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 and then they're expelling. And that's what causes our dough to rise double. Every bread recipe, it'll say ferment. Well, it'll say proof it, but proof is not the real term. It is fermenting. You are bulk fermenting until it doubles, right? That is what is happening during that process. And then you punch it down if the recipe calls for punching down, and then you shape it. Then we proof it for that additional 30 minutes, okay? So make sure you have an understanding. There is a difference between bulk fermenting, which is the initial rise. It's when our yeast are really active. They're in their comfy zone, and they are eating up all them carbs and sugars, and they are expelling that carbon dioxide and that ethanol, all right? Again, that's fermentation. Now, during the baking process, yeast continues to release gases, and they become trapped in the baking process. So remember that, okay? Again, yeast, here we go. Yeast remains dominant at temperatures below 34 degrees, okay? And I'm on page 945, table 32.1, if you're following along. They remain dormant. That's why typically they're either dehydrated or they're kept in a freezer or a refrigerator or something like that. And you have to wake them up. When the temperature reaches 75 to 95, that's when they're most active, okay? They're most active. Now, if they're completely dehydrated, like active dry yeast, you're waking them up. But as that temperature cools, okay, and what's the temp that we wake yeast up at? Because I don't want you to get confused. What's the temp we wake yeast up at if it's active dry yeast?
105 to 110.
And that's important. Yes, 105 to 110. You're going to need that for quiz 1, quiz 2, and your final. That is a very important temperature range to know. Now, that is different from the temperature that they are most active, which is 75 to 95. And then another temp you need to remember is yeast die at 138, okay? So during that baking process, as your baked good heats up to 138 and beyond, your yeast actually dies. So don't think you're eating live yeast, okay? It actually does die. And again, the three types, you have compressed, which is considered your fresh yeast. And it's got to be rehydrated as well. Your active dry has to be rehydrated. And then, of course, your instant, it can be put straight into, if you ever see them throw yeast straight into your flour and your product, that is a instant yeast. It's going to use the moisture and the heat within your recipe to actually start working, okay? So make sure you understand that. A sourdough starter, some of y'all have heard of sourdough starters, and people actually, I know Chef Dahl, she has a sourdough starter that she feeds every week, and she takes a portion of it and she uses it, and then she just keeps going. That is a natural formed yeast. And believe it or not, yeast is everywhere, okay? You ever leave apple juice or some sort of fruit juice sitting out on the countertop, next thing you know, it's got this moldy looking stuff. You know, it's got yeast activity happening. So it's a natural yeast leavener that is made with equal parts of flour and water, or it can be made with some natural fruit juices. Grapes, apple peels, orange rinds are added. And those things contain yeast spores, so they help get your natural yeast or your starter going. And over time, again, I asked you guys, if you ever have the opportunity, when I went to Paris, okay, the first thing I wanted to do was go to a Parisian bake shop. Oh my gosh, I can show you some pictures. It makes American bakeries. I'm not going to say it makes them horrible, but they pale in comparison to a real French patisserie, okay? And you walk in and you have fresh baked bread that's baked on it. I mean, they do it every day. And in France and other European countries, they don't use the additives and the preservatives that we have in America. I think we touched on that before. Their food regulations are way different than American regulations, and therefore their products, you know, we buy a loaf of bread. How long does your loaf of bread last in your cabinet at home? Somebody weigh in on that. RJ, how long does your bread last? RJ, you still with me?
I say about a week.
About a week. Josh, how long does your bread last?
About the same, but it also varies depending on what time of year it is, because if it's during the summertime, then it'll usually go for no more than 5 days with the heat. If it's in winter, then I can push it to a max of 9 before I start having to worry about it. Right.
Latasha, how long does your bread last when you buy
it? 2 days, because that's how long it takes for the kids to eat it all. So I really don't.
Love it. Love it. So guess what? Bread is not designed to last that long. The reason American bread typically lasts that long, and I shouldn't say American, any processed, preservative-laden byproduct food, it has all these additives to it to preserve the life of it. If you have really fresh bread with natural ingredients, it's only going to last 2 or 3 days. It's not designed to last a whole week, right? So sourdough starter in particular, if you ever have, that was a lot of words to say, if you ever have a true French baguette and it is made, I mean, there are some bakeries that have starters that are years and years old. And so they develop that rich flavor. And that's that nice, deep, rich, yeasty flavor that you get in a baguette comes from that sourdough starter. Even bread, like Josh, you told me you're making bread. The bread that you're making quick and you're not using a starter, it's not going to have that really deep sourdough flavor that comes from a sourdough starter, okay? Now, production stages of yeast bread. It is important that, again, Production stages are like techniques that we talked about yesterday. These should be common knowledge. When you get ready, if a chef walks up to you and says, hey, I need you to prep this bread, the one thing I want to point out, you're used to looking at recipes that people design for home bakers. If you're Googling recipes, when you walk into a kitchen, the recipes are not going to spell out, get your pot and pans out, get this out, get that out. You're going to be expected to know how to make bread, the steps, the production steps of how to make bread, okay? They're not going to cover every little detail. You need to know the techniques. If you know the technique of bread making, that's how you make all your breads. Does that make sense? Y'all follow me there? Everybody, thumbs up if you do. So the 10 stages, obviously you're going to scale your ingredients, and in the bake shop, we use a scale, correct? What increment do we like to use in a bake shop? Who can tell me?
Grams.
Grams, absolutely. And in your book, we will be using grams. You notice grams are alongside the ounces. Now, hear me. Not every bake shop is going to use grams, but the majority of your professional pastry chefs and their shops, they're going to use grams, okay? You're going to mix and knead the dough, all right? Now, you can do that by hand. You'll always see recipes or formulas that say, you know, mix your ingredients, bring your dough together, then knead 5 to 10 minutes. That could be by hand, okay? It's going to be a little bit shorter if you're going to use a mixer, okay, with the dough hook on it. So keep that in mind, all right? You're not always going by time, you're going by appearance as well. When it looks like a smooth ball of dough, you've probably reached your kneading time. And some formulas will actually tell you to an internal temperature of so-and-so. You're going to knead that dough to a specific temperature or till a window pane is achieved. And that's where you take a little piece of that dough and you're working it and you're stretching it out, and you're able to stretch it out so thin that you can kind of see through it without it cracking. That's going to be a window pane, okay? You're going to ferment the dough, and remember, this is not proofing, this is fermenting. That's going to be your bulk fermentation. That is the first rise. Then you're typically going to punch the dough down. That's going to release those gases that have been trapped. And then you're going to portion your dough. And then from there, you're going to shape it. And then you will do your proof, which would be considered your second rise, okay? From there, you're going to bake your doughs. Typically, you're going to wash them. And there's several different types of washes. You can use egg whites. It can be a whole egg mixture. It can be milk. I've seen buttermilk, just whatever your recipe calls for or whatever you prefer, you're going to wash it. Some of them, like if you're doing sourdough breads and stuff, y'all ever see the nice little marks on top of breads or products? You see those marks? That's where you're taking a scoring tool, or in our case here, we'll actually be using our paring knives. You're going to score those. They not only create a visual, pleasant looking loaf, but they act as a vent for your steam to escape from your bread, okay? So you're creating vent holes for the steam and the gases to escape as your bread is baking, all right? So that, yes, while they look pretty, they're also there for a purpose, so know that. And then you're gonna cool and store your finished products. Now, how many of you actually go to, where was I? You go to the store, and I know for me, whenever I go to Blimpie or something like that, I always ask for day-old bread, and people look at me like I'm crazy. Fresh baked bread is going to have that crisp, crunchy, beautiful texture to it, okay? That's how you know it's fresh baked. If it's your soft bread, you know, even your sandwich bread, believe it or not, it did not go into the bag with that soft brown crust on the outside. That's what happens when it's closed up, the humidity and the steam, it softens, okay? And that's also the beginning process of the baking process called stilling. From the time it's baked, it starts deteriorating. And I'm not saying it goes bad, but it begins that stilling stage of your baking process, okay? So kind of putting that into perspective. I ask for day-old bread when I go to Blimpie because I like really soft bread. I don't want that hard. And who is it? Jersey Mike's. You ever notice you get a sub from Jersey Mike's? It's really crunchy, crusty, flaky on the outside texture. They don't actually wrap it up into the plastic wrap, which will cause it to start getting soft, okay? So understand that. Now, there are sponge methods, all right? So make sure you pay attention to that. Your sponge methods, they're also called the two-stage method. That's where you're going to put your yeast, your liquid, and part of your flour together. You're going to allow that. When we make a sponge or a poolish, if you will, you're going to make that the day before, and you're going to allow that to kind of rise. And then you will add, the second stage is adding the remaining ingredients, okay? That's going to give your dough, it's going to give it a different bit of flavor, but it also makes a lighter loaf, all right? So keep that in mind. Controlling fermentation, there's several ways you can control fermentation. Now remember, fermentation is which rise? Who can tell me? Chateria, fermentation is which rise? Chateria, hi Chateria. Fermentation is which rise of the dough? Do you know?
You said fermentation?
Fermentation, bulk fermentation. Which rise is that?
Which rise?
Somebody, yeah, somebody help her out. Your mom's helping you out there. First rise. Thank you, Latasha. So bulk fermentation, okay, is the first rise. You can control that rise, all right, by temperature. If you were to take your dough and put it in a cooler place in your house, it's going to, or in the kitchen, it's going to slow that rise. If you put it in a warmer place, it's going to rise quicker, correct? Now, if you, I know there are some doughs that we will actually put in the refrigerator. It will retard, that's the word you use, it will retard in the refrigerator overnight. And then we will bring it out, warm it up, and shape it and form it into our whatever, and then we will proof it at that stage. So those are some ways. Adjusting the sugar in your recipe, all right? Because what does yeast feed on? Carbs and sugar. So you can adjust with the amount of sugar, you know, you can control your fermentation. We already talked about warm water, letting it rise in a warm place, using cooler water. That's why some recipes you'll see it is say use 70-degree water or room temperature water. They don't want it activating until you're ready for it to activate, all right? So gauging bread doneness, and this is going to bring us to the end of this chapter. Yay, yay. Y'all don't look too excited all at once. I promise when we come back to class, it's going to be way more fun. Gauging doneness. Doneness is, it's met when it has a uniform, rich, golden brown exterior, okay? Y'all know what bread crust needs to look like, right? If it fails to reach that, it's not quite done. When you tap it on the bottom, and you'll see me do this when y'all come back to the kitchen, when we turn bread over, when you thump it, it should have a hollow sound. It should sound hollow, if you will. Also, you can take internal temperatures of your bread. 190 for your lean doughs, and lean doughs would be like your baguette and things of that nature. A enriched dough has eggs. That's going to be kind of like your brioche, okay? That's going to be an enriched dough, and that's going to be about 180 to 190. Your lean doughs are 190 to 210. So again, I always say around 190, you're pretty safe. That is my go-to. If I stick a thermometer, and I'm going to tell you, don't stick it in the top of your bread. You don't want a hole in top of your bread, but stick it either in the side or the bottom. And if you're around 190 and you've got that beautiful brown exterior, then you know, and you thump it, you got that hollow sound, your bread is done. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about today? When you come back to class, we will be briefly going over this stuff. I got a couple of videos. I'm going to shoot y'all a challah braiding video, which is really, really cool. I will put it up on Moodle, or I may send it to y'all email. It's really cool to look at. We will be doing challah when y'all come back, and y'all get to braid it up. I did have one student last class that she was brave enough. She was great at braiding. I admit, I am not. I had a boy. I can braid my hair a little bit, but she tackled the 6 braid challah, and it was beautiful. Oh my God, it was beautiful. So anyway, I'll shoot that so y'all can take a look at that. Other than that, that really touches on all the bases of bread. The typical bread we will be doing will be a straight dough, okay? That's where you're putting your ingredients in to your mixer, and you're mixing and kneading, and then you're fermenting, and then you are shaping and then proofing. So it's pretty, lack of better term, straightforward, okay? Anybody got any questions? No? Y'all good? All right, so remember tomorrow we'll dive into pastry day 1. We will meet for those that were late and are going to tell me that you didn't know we had class today. We're having class every day, guys, every day, 10 o'clock, every day. If you have any other questions, I'm always here. Just reach out and touch me some way or another, all right? Other than that, I'm going to say bye-bye. Y'all wave to our online friends. Woo-hoo.